Hi, listeners. A note. I don't usually give trigger warnings. The series inherently is unsettling because it focuses on crimes. I make a point to present things respectfully and am careful not to be gratuitous with my descriptions. I'll do that here too, but the case has a few elements I can't downplay if I want to tell it accurately. Please take care. Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Arthur Shawcross gave a reason for the awful things he had done. He said his childhood was filled with sexual abuse. It began, he said, when he was just 8. He said his Aunt Tina came to his parents' home frequently and always reached into his pants to molest him. Soon, he said, his mother Betty took up the habit. Artie had started out a pretty good student, but that changed, as he told it, when the abuse started, so much so that he was barely getting promoted into the next grade. Sullen and angry, he was the kid no teacher could reach, though it's hard to know how hard any truly tried. The abuse from the adults in his life was so profound that he remembered every disturbing detail vividly. Like the time he said a toilet brush handle was shoved up his rectum so far that his peritoneum ruptured. Kids at school weren't aware of any of this, of course. All they knew was that little Artie Shawcross was bizarre among his peers. They found him a bully and said they fought back in similarly bullying ways by calling him names and repeatedly mocking him for using baby talk. Shawcross dropped out of school at 16 after having failed the 9th grade, which meant he had few future prospects and no self-control, was somewhat violent and deeply confused, and, this goes without saying but I'll say it anyway, badly damaged as a human being. He would later have no qualms about reporting these details to all kinds of law enforcement types, as well as medical and mental health professionals. It was his way of explaining what motivated him to do such terrible, heinous, monstrous things. None of these deeds were his fault, he said. He'd been made into a monster. He told them that he began masturbating, also at age 8, though he still wet the bed. He explained that he engaged in baby talk to get attention and lied even when the truth was obvious or would have made life easier for him and made him feel in control. He also said that he had lived his whole life in order to please his domineering and fault-finding mother. A long-lost daughter who would connect with him in prison, Maggie Deming, told producers of A&E's documentary series First Blood,
he told me it wasn't a very loving relationship between him and his mother. That she was very domineering, controlling, always criticized him. And his mother would ridicule him in front of the family. His own family would laugh at him. He was like the odd man out.
Dr. Kachita Monk, a criminologist and professor at Cal State LA, goes further.
Imagine as a child the amount of shame that you feel. And what that could mean is that you are trying to please someone that cannot be pleased.
Shawcross said his first homosexual experience occurred at 11 with a neighbor boy. Then he moved on to oral sex with his brother and full-on sexual intercourse with his sister Jeannie, who he once told an interviewer was the first person he vowed to kill when he got out of prison. He also killed small animals and had sex with large animals as a boy. Even those who professed to love him called him weird. True crime author Jeffrey Wansel.
He was nicknamed as Oddie because he was regarded as so strange and difficult. And in a way, I think he took pleasure from that. I think he enjoyed being separate. He liked being the loner.
What the hell was wrong with little Artie Shawcross? That question would be the subject of an ongoing discussion throughout his life. It would be the thing that stumped his family, bewildered police and prosecutors, and pitted expert witnesses and psychiatrists against one another, publicly, privately, and professionally. Insanity is a hard nut to crack. Criminal insanity is even more so. In the case of Arthur Shawcross, his rage was real, and he lived in a way that made others feel that rage. Now mix his traumatic and disturbing childhood as he remembered it with some equally horrifying post-traumatic stress from his time in Vietnam, and you get 2 children and at least 11 adults sacrificed horribly to his abnormal psyche before he was stopped. But who or what is to blame for his crimes? That'll be the issue when the prosecutors in upstate New York must decide what to do with Shawcross. He won't make it easy. For starters, he didn't even have an Aunt Tina. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. You know all about Wild Grain, don't you, Scott?
I sure do. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for artisanal breads, pastries, and pastas.
I just made some wild grain pasta the other night. It took less than 25 minutes from start to finish with no thawing necessary, and most importantly,
it was delicious.
It really was. Wild Grain's boxes are fully customizable to your taste and dietary restrictions. In addition to their classic variety box, they recently launched a new gluten-free box and a plant-based box that is 100% vegan.
Are you ready to bring all your favorite carbs right to your doorstep? Be sure to check out Wild Grain so you can begin building your own box of artisanal breads, pastas, and pastries.
For a limited time, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off the first box plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC to start your subscription. You heard me, free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC.
That's wildgrain.com/COTC, or you can use promo code COTC at checkout.
If you know how serial killers are typically made, you might guess what happened next. Arthur Shawcross went from bedwetting animal torturer to arsonist, being put on probation at 18 for some minor vandalism, though he was suspected of much more. In 1964, at just 19, he married his first wife, Sarah Chatterton. They had a son, but Shawcross was soon again in trouble, again put on probation, this time on burglary charges. Chatterton ditched him, telling the court he was abusive. He did her the favor of signing away all his parental rights to the 18-month-old boy. The Vietnam War was wearing on, and in April 1967, no surprise, Shawcross was drafted, and a week before he was shipped out, he married again, this time to Linda Neary. She met his parents, who lived just outside of Watertown, New York. Neary told Jack Olson, author of The Misbegotten Son, that Art talked, quote, constantly about his mother, how much he loved her and how she didn't love him, how he wanted her approval and couldn't get it. He'd always say, no matter what I do, it ain't right, end quote. When the announcement of their marriage made the newspaper, Arthur's first wife called Neary to let her know what she was in for. Per Neary, quote, she said he was violent and she'd always been afraid of what he might do to the baby. I flat out didn't believe her. I'd seen him with his son a couple of times and he was very gentle, end quote. Neary told Olson that Betty thought there was something very wrong with Art, specifically with his brain. He'd been knocked unconscious a few times, she said, and it warped his thinking. Neary got letters from Art while he was overseas. They were filled with graphic descriptions. He wrote that he'd seen kids killed and had to bag his dead, mutilated friends. His mother, Betty, meanwhile, got letters from Art which said he'd been hit by shrapnel in a big battle. That was news to his wife. She didn't know what to expect when he got home. Later, Shawcross told everyone about his daring do while in the Army from September 1968 to October 1967. He told how often he went out on solitary raids where he first became acquainted with killing and, frankly, enjoyed every minute of it.
What happened in Vietnam?
A lot of things happened in Vietnam.
In talking to a British TV show called Real Stories, Arthur told one of his supposed exploits there. Again, let me warn you, it's deeply disturbing to listen to.
Well, I went to Vietnam as a weapons specialist. And I had my own bunker and just outside of Kon Tum, Vietnam, Central Highlands. And I see a woman in her 30s coming down this hill carrying 2 AKs on this side and 2 AKs on this side, barrel down. So I reach over my shoulder like this, right behind my neck, and I pull out a brand new machete. When she backed out, I come up behind her and took her head right there. I took a couple of hits, but the head came off. She body dropped to the ground, she just bled out. I split the body in half. Opened up a pouch and I had some C4, plastic explosives, lit a cigarette, just touched it, and it started lit up like a miniature sun. And I just laid the flesh up on top of that stick, right? And I bit into the flesh itself.
He did that in order to get the second woman to tell him where the enemy soldiers were hiding, which she did. He liked that work, laying claim to killing at least 39 in equally vicious ways. Not that war and its necessary killing is ever pretty, but his stories were beyond typical and always shrieked with some kind of excessive cruelty. Later, when asked by experts to name some of his buddies while stationed 13 months in Vietnam that year, he could not remember a single man. Shawcross chalked that up to his being a loner, someone others might have been afraid of. The FBI, New York police agencies, and reporters at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle would all track down the facts about Shawcross's Army record, only to discover that he was a supply clerk who was stationed in an area far from combat, that he never killed anyone while there, that he would not have had the opportunity. The reporters even found a sergeant who explained that his soldiers were actually very protected from the fighting, sort of in a capsulized safe zone. But that would be uncovered later. For now, he got back to the U.S. and to his second wife, who soon began to see the behavior that his first wife had warned her about. Neary accused him of being abusive and of liking to light fires. She divorced him. He was, in fact, charged with arson and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served a little less than 2 years before being released. He went back to Watertown, then married a local woman named Penny Sherbino, a single mom to 2 toddlers. Maybe what happened next was a long time coming. Maybe it was just the latest in a string of heretofore undiscovered murders. Hard to say. But in September 1972, a 10-year-old boy went missing in Watertown. Jack Blake had already had a sad life, the 7th of 9 children, born to uneducated backwoods parents who could barely scrounge food and shelter for themselves. His father beat him, though his mother Mary would swear that the boy's real father was a much kinder man named Bob, whom she occasionally slept with. Anyway, Jack was blonde, freckled, thoughtful, and liked to fish with a really nice guy he and his little brother Pete had met. That guy was named Art. Mary didn't much like the sound of that, though she didn't know the man. Still, don't be hanging with him, she said. Jack and Petey were torn because Art was nice to them. Then, one late night, after their parents had been out playing bingo and drinking, they found out Jack had not come home. No one in authority paid much attention to Mary Blake that night as she frantically searched for her child. A cursory search was done in the nearby woods the next day. No Jack. She decided to talk to a newspaper reporter and got a little piece in the paper about the disappearance. The cops came back around and, when she told them about Art Shawcross, sat him down for a chat. He admitted he had seen Jack that day, but didn't have any other information. As per the Watertown Daily Times, the cops reported, quote, "We have questioned the man and there is nothing to the story. We've been doing everything we can and have checked every possibility. We talked to friends of the boy and have been told he left the area," end quote. He was 10. What'd he do, drive to the airport, show his passport, and wing it to Venezuela? Sorry, sometimes this kind of stuff just makes me shake my head. Poor Mary. Police told her they believed Jack had just run away. She and her husband hadn't been parents of the year, so that's the conclusion they had reached. One even said, "That boy don't want to be found." 4 months later, on Labor Day, 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill and her babysitter were brought along on a short trip to Watertown with her single mother and her boyfriend. The girl's 2 brothers stayed home with an aunt. Maybe we can chalk this up to 1972 being a simpler time, but Karen, remember, she's just 8, wandered off and was missing for a few hours in a strange town before anyone wondered where she might have gone off to. By 4 p.m., her mother started actively looking. By 6, she'd called the police. A few minutes later, Mary Blake's neighbor rushed in to tell Mary that a little honey-blonde, blue-eyed child who had been playing with her children was now missing. Mary Blake dropped what she was doing and started to round up folks to look for the child. She knew what that mom was feeling, and she certainly didn't trust the police to take the case seriously. By 10 p.m., following a lead phoned in by a man who had seen the little girl on the concrete embankment of the Black River which flowed through Watertown, the police found Karen Hill. She was face down, her upper torso covered in rocks, her mouth stuffed with leaves and dirt to muffle her screams. Her face looked beaten, and she'd been strangled with a part of her own clothing. The coroner determined that she had been raped. Semen was present in both her ripped vagina and in her rectal cavity. Shawcross had been on everybody's radar in Watertown since Jack had gone missing. He'd been suspected of setting a fire at the public housing apartments he and Penny lived in, but evidence had been scant. He'd even been fined for spanking a 6-year-old and stuffing grass down his pants. He was a weirdo, for sure, but the police had finally started to worry that it was more than that. Things moved pretty fast. Shawcross was interrogated without much luck, then released. Dogs were then employed to track the killer from the embankment, and they landed, the next day, at Shawcross's apartment door. Hours of intense interrogation followed. Then an exhausted Shawcross said, "I probably did it, but I don't actually remember." He added later, "I must have done it." That's not what you would call a great confession, but police gave him time to rest in jail while they followed up. Art lawyered up. Cops wanted more answers. One of them said, "Art, somebody told us they saw you leading Jack Blake into Poole's Woods." He responded, "Not Poole's Woods." Jesus, man, either tell them or don't. A day later, Shawcross asked his lawyer to ask if he helped find Jack, what was in it for him. Now, this is as close to an admission as you can get, short of an actual admission. So you might think, aha, gotcha, right? He's saying he knows where Jack is, Jack who's been missing for 5 agonizing months, and he wants something for it? Why would police give him anything when they now know he was involved? Well, that's tricky. The police had no real hard evidence. They still had no body, no answers, nothing. So they needed him. They needed his info to learn what had happened to Jack, and to get that info, they'd obviously have to offer something to Art, no matter how disgusting that felt. So the detectives said they would do their best talking to prosecutors if he showed them where Jack was. He agreed to that. Mary Blake couldn't identify her child by sight. He was merely a skeleton by then. Instead, she ID'd Jack by the sneakers she had just bought him before he went missing, and by a mend she had made in the jacket he had worn. The clothes were not found on the child, but scattered nearby. He'd been naked when he'd been strangled to death. Shawcross told investigators that he'd eaten Jack's genitals. When doctors examined Shawcross in his cell, they found he had lower than average IQ, but noted nothing irregular neurologically. One psychiatrist diagnosed him as a schizoid psychopath. Paul Deerdorf, Shawcross's court-assigned defense attorney, tried to help him, but
when he was agitated, really agitated, he was scary. You wouldn't want to be in the room with him alone. He looked a little strange, to be honest with you, and I did not get in the cell with him like I ordinarily would. I would always stay outside the cell, so we had the steel bars between us.
The plea bargain that the Watertown prosecutor didn't want to make but did had Shawcross plead guilty to one charge of manslaughter, which carried a 25-year sentence in prison. After 14 years, in 1987, he was released, with prison officials saying he was no longer dangerous. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Galatea by Inkit. A good book is great, but what if you had an endless library of delicious romance at your fingertips?
I'd never leave the house.
That's the dream. With Galatea, you don't just read, you get swept away in every stolen glance and heart-pounding touch you can't stop thinking about. Whatever kind of love story you crave, you can find it on Galatea.
What are we advertising here?
Galatea is a reading app where anyone craving a little me time can dive into a library of romance stories that leave you feeling recharged and fulfilled. They have over 1,000 bestsellers to choose from.
That's a lot of titles.
Galatea is home to original series and standalone stories with an exclusive catalog of best-selling authors with new chapters dropping daily, so there's always something new to explore. Over 30 million people have fallen in love with reading on Galatea. Join now to indulge in stories that make you feel like yourself again.
That'll curb a lot of doom scrolling.
Exactly. Right now, Galatea is offering our listeners an extra 25% off an already irresistibly affordable subscription when you go to galatea.com/COTC. That's GALATEA.com/COTC to indulge in unlimited stories for even less. galatea.com/COTC. Let's be honest, no one wants a convicted child killer in their town, even if some Nimrod with a degree says the murderer is no longer dangerous. So after Arthur Shawcross's release from prison, he was relocated to 3 different towns: Binghamton, Delhi, and Fleischmann's, a tiny burg in the Catskills. Along the way, he hooked up with a woman named Rose Marie Wally, who had lived and worked in Delhi for years. In each town the couple visited, officials there would be told of their location. Word spread, shifting the welcome wagon abruptly into reverse, with effective protests launched to get that bastard away from their children. The pair had been in Delhi just 2 weeks before they were told to leave. Finally, the couple landed in Rochester, New York, a town that's the original headquarters of Kodak, Xerox, Gannett, and Bausch & Lomb. So it was and is prosperous, filled with innovators and artists, as well as being a manufacturing hub and solidly middle class. The Erie Canal once took the same course as one of its freeways. Someone forgot to report Shawcross's new address to the good people who lived there. His parole officer knew, of course, and after a brief hello, suggested that Art get some mental health counseling. Though notably reticent, he went. As Olson reports in his book on Shawcross, he was found, quote, to be suffering from a grab bag of behavioral problems, including inhibited sexual excitement, inhibited orgasms, adult antisocial behavior, mixed personality disorders, secondary impotence, sexual sadism, and a prostate ailment, end quote. The therapist appears to have either been incompetent or bewildered. He advised Shawcross to read a book called What You Still Don't Know About Male Sexuality. I shudder. Shawcross got a job making prepared salads for sale for a food processing company. A menial job, but ex-cons without a lot of education can't be too picky. Rose Marie made $4.35 an hour working as a home healthcare worker. He professed to love Rose Marie, but soon got himself a side squeeze, a hard-working woman named Clara Neal who had spent her early life in Appalachian poverty. Oh, and he also frequented area sex workers. He became a regular on the side of town where such commerce went on. It may or may not surprise you to learn that his wife and his mistress fought over him later. Funny thing about Arthur and all that sex he was supposedly having, he would report, something later confirmed by his wife, mistress, and sex workers, that he would seldom, if ever, reach climax, which made him mad. In March of 1988, one of their number went missing. A very pretty Dorothy Blackburn, 27, was known to the cops. A professional relationship, you might say. She was found less than a week after being reported missing by her sister. Blackburn was found floating face down in Salmon Creek on Route 21 in Sweden, a Rochester suburb. Then came Anne-Marie Steffen. Her skeletal remains were found in September 1988 near Rochester's Driving Park Bridge. Authorities had to consult a facial reconstruction expert to create a composite of what she might have looked like in life. Her father identified her and told police she had turned to sex work to provide for herself. She was pregnant when she died. The two women's deaths were, sadly, seen as an accepted risk in their business. No one thought they were connected. Until a year later when, in October 1989, the body of Dorothy Keller was found in the Genesee River Gorge. A surprise here was that Keller was 60 and had been decapitated. A week later, another skeleton was found on Seth Green Island in the Genesee River. She would be identified a few weeks later as Frances Brown, again a woman in the sex trade. Then, just a week later, the body of another missing woman was found behind one of the local YMCAs by some kids who'd been playing ball. Her name was Patricia Ives. She was just 25. Just 2 months earlier, Shawcross had finally married Rose Marie Wally. They decorated their little apartment and put on a nice spread. A lady who lived in their building made a 2-tiered wedding cake. Although a lot of family had been invited, only her daughter's boyfriend and his mom showed up. Rosemarie couldn't understand it, which might be all you need to know about poor Rosemarie. It was becoming abundantly apparent by that fall that this rash of murders was not isolated and was not a reasonable response to the victim's chosen line of work. Of the dead, most, but not all, had been working on Lyell Avenue. Each had been strangled to death and bitten posthumously. The police knew that the killer was growing progressively more violent. There was also some indication that while the killer had left the women in rather random locations to be found by others, there was evidence that he had returned to either carve them up further or initiate sex anew. FBI profiler Greg McCrary.
One of the big questions was, well, how's he getting these women? These prostitutes are scared to death, and they're being killed. Yet, he seems to have no trouble getting them. The answer is, he's a regular client. They know him. They go with him, they have successful sex, he drives them back, drops them off, no problem. So they're not afraid to go with him. It's just some nights it goes terribly wrong.
Rochester police tried warning the women of Lyell Avenue that a girl has to make a living, and most must have felt they could trust their own instincts. Still, streetwise Joanne Van Nostrand talked to police that early November and said there was this guy named Mitch, or maybe it was Mike, who paid good money for her to pretend to be dead while he pretended to strangle her. Maybe it was nothing, but she'd mentioned it to the other women on the street, and they knew this guy and they considered him volatile. He came around a lot. The cops took notice. Arthur Shawcross also took notice, telling his girlfriend and wife to be careful, lock their doors, don't talk to strange men. Then Marie Welch, 22, went missing November 5th. On November 14th, the now-defunct Rochester Times-Union reported first that 8 women were missing and that the Rochester Police Department was deeply concerned that the deaths may be connected. It was the first time the citizenry had been made aware of the killings. The police were not pleased. This was followed the next day by the discovery of sex worker Kimberly Logan, age 30. On Thanksgiving, yet another body was found. June Stott, who was not a sex worker but still a hard-working woman, maybe considered a little slow but making life work for her. That was not the only thing that separated her from the others. It was the way that she was found. Stott had been beaten before she died by strangulation. Then the murderer cut her, a la Jack the Ripper, from her throat to her pubic bone. He had mutilated her anally as well. Her labia had also been cut out and was missing. No semen, as before, was found at the scene, which was far from the killer's usual dumping grounds. A few days later, another Lyell Avenue sex worker, Elizabeth Gibson, 29, was found strangled and stashed in an adjacent county. It was past time to call in the FBI, who could, at best, advise the Rochester police and the New York State Police because, as horrible as they were, the killings did not constitute a federal crime. But they could profile this guy, and they could offer up a helpful tip. If this guy was returning to mutilate or try to have sex with his dead victims, maybe the police should watch for a while when the next body was found. Maybe their killer would make a command performance. Worth a shot. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Haya.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy additives growing kids should never eat.
Well, that's why Haya created a super-powered chewable vitamin. It's made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy additives.
Yet it tastes great and is perfect for picky eaters.
Or, as the kiddo in this house likes to say, not a picky eater per se, but just someone with a different taste in food.
That's right.
And are you tired of battling with your kids to eat their greens? Haya now has Kids Daily Greens Plus Superfoods, a chocolate-flavored greens powder designed specifically for kids, packed with 55 plus whole food ingredients to support brain power, development, and digestion. Just scoop, shake, and sip with milk or any non-dairy beverage for a delicious and nutritious boost your kids will actually enjoy. We've worked out a special deal with Haya for the best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order.
To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/COTC. This deal is not available on their regular website.
Go to hiyahealth.com/COTC and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Rochester's far suburbs sit at the edge of Lake Ontario. That means that while it can get colder than cold there, the region is also victim to something called lake effect snow, which occurs when the icy Arctic winds and temperature systems drive south across Canada to make their way to the U.S. by skimming the Great Lakes. Those lakes have temperatures that, well, not hot, are warmer than the air, and that warmth and moisture is picked up and held until, well, it hits land and dumps snow by the truckful across the immediate area. Police really did think this whole winter phenomenon would quiet the killer while they gathered their thoughts. December brought more deaths. First, 32-year-old Darlene Trippi disappeared on the 15th. Then, 2 days later, so did longtime Lyle Avenue veteran June Cicero, age 34. Just as the year was ending, Felicia Stevens, just 20, also vanished off the street, never to be found. Nobody who worked in law enforcement had an easy Christmas, with air searches, mounted police, armed road stops, and riverbank canvassing at an almost non-stop operation as weather permitted. On January 2nd, 1990, John McCafferty of the New York State Police was in a helicopter surveying a stretch of water.
We were less than 2 minutes into the flight from Northampton Park back to Rochester when we flew over Salmon Creek. And underneath the bridge, I could see a body frozen in the ice.
And then McCaffrey spotted a suspicious-looking car on the bridge itself.
The passenger door was open, and it appeared that he had been urinating out of the car. And that's what we could see. And as the helicopter flew by, he closed the passenger door and slid across into the driver's seat and started to proceed easterly on Route 31.
Uniformed police on the ground managed to pull the man over, and when they asked him for his driver's license, he responded he didn't have one because he was a convicted felon on parole. Meanwhile, McCafferty had the helicopter land near where he'd seen the body. He and another officer saw what they believed was June Cicero, clearly the victim of strangulation. She had been repeatedly bitten. Her vagina was missing. But the police had their hands on 44-year-old Arthur Shawcross, a man who could not keep himself from talking about everything he had done and all that had happened, including a lot of stuff that didn't. The first time investigators talked to Arthur Shawcross, he told them his life story up until he ventured onto Lyle Avenue. Just didn't go there. But he was on their radar now, and his picture was in their hands, and they took it to the working women on the avenue, and sure enough, it was that Mitch guy they'd been talking about. So odd, so quick-tempered, creepy, but a familiar face. The forensic people had also been busy. Rochester Police Captain Lynn Johnson explained,
We found under the sink these handy wipe, dusting type of material that was found at the scene of June Stott and also at the Dorothy Keeler scene. And overnight, we contacted the company in Ohio that manufacture them, and they told us that the only place in Rochester that has them was G&G Cheese, and that's the place he worked.
This warranted a second chat. Charles Saragusa, the assistant district attorney of Monroe County, had an idea that might get Shawcross talking. He had investigators put 16 pictures of the women who'd been killed recently on individual cards and made a nice stack. The investigators kept bringing the pictures out, laying them out like a Vegas dealer to ask more and more questions, trying to elicit some reaction from Shawcross, and he just wore down.
I just got tired of it after 14, 16 hours later.
Tired of what?
All what was coming at me. I just couldn't handle it.
The first thing he did was correct them. He didn't know anything about 5 of those women. The others, he took responsibility for. His random excuses for why each had to die came rolling out. That one had laughed at his impotence. That one had stolen his wallet. That one had been his housekeeper and she had sticky fingers. That one had peed in his mouth. Another, Miss Stott, had been a friend, but she could identify him and he decided to mutilate her so she would decompose faster. The others, he liked to tell officials, especially if there were women in the room when he was being investigated, he ate, describing for them what that was like. Raw steak, he said. The men in the room were regaled with his murderous lust in Vietnam, his perceived work for the country, his unrelenting ability to inflict all kinds of pain. Then he described his abusive childhood, replete with his mother's voice in his head when he killed those women, doing her bidding, showing her he could be as vicious and hurtful as she. He attached no emotion to any of it.
Do you have any comprehension of the suffering that you've brought the families of the people that you've killed?
I don't have any remorse for some reason.
Ultimately, Arthur Shawcross was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder in Rochester's Monroe County and another in nearby Wayne County. He would thenceforth be referred to as the Genesee River Killer. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Smalls. Tell me something Betty Lou the cat did recently.
She viciously clawed me while demanding pets as I was falling asleep last night.
Oh, that's so cute. Did she leave marks?
You know she did.
Well, it's a good sign when Betty Lou does that because it means she's feeling happy and frisky, and that's exactly how we want her. And that's why we feed her Smalls. Betty Lou loves Smalls, which New York Magazine called the best cat food, according to veterinarians.
BuzzFeed said my cats went completely ballistic for this stuff. Betty does too.
After switching to Smalls, 88% of cat owners reported overall health improvements, and that's a big deal.
What are you waiting for? Give your cat the food they deserve. Head to smalls.com and use promo code COTC at checkout for 50% off your first order plus free shipping.
That's the best offer you'll find, but you have to use my code COTC for 50% off your first order. One last time, that's promo code COTC for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. Most complicated murder trials feature what I call the battle of the experts. The trial against Arthur Shawcross had more of a showdown. I mean, it had everything. Forensic experts, investigator testimony on both sides, and Shawcross's own confession. It was so engrossing, the local cable TV station broadcast it live in its entirety for those in its viewing radius. Was the man insane? Enough to be not guilty? A veritable parade of psych superstars weighed in. Dr. Jonathan Pincus, a neurologist at Georgetown University and a man who had examined the brains of convicted serial killers, gave the defense's point of view when speaking to a British interviewer.
Everybody knows there's something wrong with Arthur Shawcross. He's not a normal person. Everybody. You know that just from the beginning. So what is it? Could there be something neurologically wrong with him?
Pincus maintained there was.
If you have a lesion on the MRI, you've got an abnormality in the EEG coming from exactly the same place, and behavior that's rather bizarre that comes from this part of the brain. I think it's likely that the abnormality of the brain has something to do with his behavior. So much that I think that had he not been neurologically abnormal, I think he probably would not have been a serial murderer.
This was followed by Yale University psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis, who examined Shawcross extensively, even hypnotizing him to elicit childhood memories, which he, rather dramatically, acted out on videotape. At one point in the hypnosis sessions, he held his penis. In another, he took on a multiple personality named Aramis, a reincarnated cannibal from 13th century England who, he swore, taught him how to eat flesh. He even took on a falsetto to speak as his mother. The prosecution's forensic expert, Dr. Park Dietz, said of the hypnosis, quote, "This is not psychiatry. It is a performance elicited by Dr. Lewis," end quote. Dietz, the most renowned of forensic psychiatrists at the time, had testified in the trials of Ted Kaczynski, Jeffrey Dahmer, the DC sniper, John Hinckley, and Andrea Yates. He had spoken extensively as well to Ted Bundy. On the Monroe County stand, Dietz appeared wise, unamused, and methodical compared to Lewis, who, according to the New York Times, had, quote, a frazzled demeanor, an inability to answer in either a yes or no, and had lengthy digressions on Freud and a disheveled file of notes, end quote. Pincus would later say he would be astonished to discover that the abuse Shawcross had said he experienced never happened. Yet Shawcross's family would maintain to his last day that none of that abuse ever occurred. To which the FBI's McCrary replied,
Few things are more tragic than the murder of a beautiful theory by a gang of brutal facts.
To be clear, there has never been any corroboration of Shawcross's abuse allegations. Nothing from his siblings, nothing from his friends, just nothing. Shawcross did not take the stand. On February 2nd, 1991, he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 to life on each count. In other words, he'd still be there in 2241. Yet another psychiatrist was hired to work the Wayne County trial for the death of Elizabeth Gibson. Dr. Richard Krause spent months evaluating Shawcross as the killer explained how he had spent years in search of an orgasm, among other things. A thorough witness expert, Krause told the prosecutors there that he was having a terrible time coming up with a specific diagnosis. The man was not like anyone Krause had ever seen in practice. In his thoroughness, though, Krause discovered something not previously discussed. Shawcross had an extraordinarily high cryptopyrrole count in his urine. What the hell is cryptopyrrole? The psychiatrist was asked. It's complicated, but I'm just going to say that high levels have been linked to psychiatric disorders, specifically schizophrenia. Shawcross was also, he discovered, born with an extra chromosome. He was, for the medical among you, a 47XYY, something which the literature indicated was consistent with, quote, a predisposition to crime and violence, end quote. Doomed, you could say. Krause never testified because Shawcross pleaded guilty before trial and received another life sentence. Arthur Shawcross died in November of 2008, age 63, with just 233 years left on his time in prison. Before his death, he talked to reporters who questioned his stories of abuse and wartime atrocities. He repeatedly spoke of seeing a white light before he killed anyone and said his mind would lapse for a while, only to wake up next to a dead woman and no recollection of her death. At other times, he gave new and specific details of those deaths.
When I picked those women up, I thought I had AIDS. Because one of the women who stopped in the car told me one of the women I took out is HIV positive. I didn't know which one of them were, so I went back and picked up all the ones I dated in 2 streets in Rochester, and I started killing them. And while I was doing it, I took the vagina of 3 and ate it. Why? I don't know. Probably to speed up the idea of the AIDS disease.
If reporters reminded him of the verifiable facts in his case, his response was the same.
I mean, when you were hauled in by the police, did you make any mention of the HIV?
No, sir, I did not.
I suppose it's because some people might say, well, isn't that just an excuse to justify killing?
You believe what you want to believe. I told you how I killed, why I killed. You don't want to believe it? That's up to you.
Sometime during his tenure at the Sullivan Corrections Facility, a daughter he had fathered with a woman in Hawaii showed up to embrace him. Maggie Deming, who has 7 children, told a reporter she wanted them to know their grandfather. As such, they regularly sent him photographs and drawings, which he said he cherished. He admitted, reluctantly, that he would be devastated if something happened to them. It's worth noting that while the sex worker murders were fair game to discuss with reporters, he adamantly refused to talk about the 2 children he raped and murdered in Watertown. It should also be noted that, before Shawcross's trial, the New York State Senate Committee on Crime and Corrections subpoenaed his parole file. The New York Times, reporting in January 1990, quoted Amy Colodny, a spokeswoman for the Correctional Services Department. Quote, "He was considered a very good prisoner," end quote. She added that he obtained his GED in 1982 and had taken a correspondence course in horticulture while at Green Haven State Prison. The result of the inquiry? In New York now, a victim or a family member of a victim can submit a written, audio-taped, or videotaped impact statement to the parole board or meet in person with a member of the board prior to any significant interview between the board and the prisoner, which may or may not have changed much. I mean, sure, it could have meant he wasn't released early from his manslaughter sentence, but that at most would have delayed his re-entry into society by 10 years. There's nothing suggesting Shawcross would have come out a different man, meaning that the only thing that would likely have changed were the names of his victims. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Jack Olson's The Misbegotten Son, a raft of stories in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle archives, including the paper's award-winning series, Shawcross, The Rage Within. She also reviewed stories in the New York Times and on the ThoughtCo website, and watched numerous documentaries about Shawcross. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through GrabBag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.